A bloody spectacle froze the room. The bodies of two men lay motionless, the floor bearing signs of a struggle and brown bloodstains. The man stood with a bloody knife, his wife beside him in shock. What began as a secret party for pleasure had ended in brutal murder. The couple at the center of the tragedy lived in a small American town. The man, then in his 40s, worked as a mechanic at a local auto repair shop. He was known as a hardworking, reserved, and quiet person. He preferred to spend his evenings at home, was devoted to his family, and had no desire for a noisy life. His wife, almost 10 years his junior, worked as a waitress at a bar. Unlike her husband, she was outgoing, enjoyed attention, connected easily with people, and spent a lot of time outside. Their marriage lasted more than 10 years. Neighbors recalled that at first, the couple seemed quite harmonious. They shared a home and household, and acquaintances described them as a typical middle-class American family. However, over time, signs of a cooling in their relationship became noticeable. The husband became increasingly tired at work and spent his evenings in the garage or in front of the TV. The wife complained of a lack of attention and sought excitement and new experiences. The financial situation was strained. The husband's salary covered basic expenses, but the family didn't have much savings. The wife longed for a more secure life, and constant conversations about the lack of money became a source of arguments. Her circle of acquaintances began to include people interested in unconventional relationships and the club scene. Gradually, she became drawn into this environment, and an interest developed in parties with elements of swinger practices. Such conversations were foreign to her husband. He perceived them as a threat to their marriage and expressed displeasure whenever he heard his wife hint at such encounters. However, there were no open confrontations at that time. He limited himself to sharp remarks and attempts to put a stop to his wife's new hobbies. According to her family, the woman made no secret of her lack of excitement. Working in a bar, she became accustomed to noisy company and the attention of men. Gradually, the difference in interests between the spouses became increasingly noticeable. Her husband, a reserved and strict man, perceived such behavior as betrayal, even if it was only conversation and flirting. The situation escalated during the year before the tragedy. His wife began to be absent from home more often in the evenings, citing extra shifts at work. Her husband suspected she was lying and tried to uncover the truth. Tensions mounted in their relationship, and conflicts became regular. By this time, the woman had already become acquainted with a group of people who attended private parties. The atmosphere of such gatherings, she told friends, seemed liberating, an opportunity to escape the mundane, to feel free and appreciated. She immersed herself more and more in this environment, even though she knew her husband would never accept it. Meanwhile, the man, sensing changes in his wife's behavior, became suspicious and irritable. He repeatedly told friends that he didn't trust his wife. He was overcome with feelings of humiliation and anger. However, he didn't take decisive steps. He didn't file for divorce or try to end the relationship. Rather, he waited for confirmation of his suspicions before acting reliably. Family life continued to appear normal on the surface. Work, home, and the occasional outing together. But behind this facade lurked a deep rift. Arguments in the home became increasingly frequent, and reconciliations became more formal. The wife increasingly lived her own life, the husband his. This rift in the relationship laid the foundation for a future tragedy. When the wife finally decided to attend a swinging party, she knew she was doing so in secret from her husband. However, it was her secret that would soon be revealed in the most brutal way. The party where the tragic events occurred was held in a private home on the outskirts of the city. It was a spacious building with several bedrooms, a living room, and a basement, where groups of people who preferred informal gatherings would gather. The organizer was a middle-aged man with connections in the community of such gatherings. His home regularly hosted private events, inviting trusted attendees. The wife of the main suspect in the case was among those invited through acquaintances. This wasn't her first such event, although she had previously tried to carefully conceal her participation. She told the man she was working an extra shift at the bar or meeting up with friends. In reality, she had attended similar parties several times, where an atmosphere of openness and informality prevailed. On the evening of the crime, there were about 10 people in the house. Among them were men and women of varying ages, from 25 to 40. Alcohol was served freely, music was loud, and the lights in the rooms were dimmed. The atmosphere was conducive to relaxation and frank behavior. The wife arrived there on her own, telling her husband she'd be late at work. She was dressed more skimpily than usual and, according to witnesses, immediately blended in. Over the first few hours, she chatted, drank, and laughed with the other guests. Gradually, the conversation became intimate, and soon she found herself in one of the bedrooms with several men. At that moment, her husband, suspicious, decided to test his wife's story. He had been following her movements several times in recent weeks, trying to catch her in a lie. That evening, he noticed she drove not to work, but to a residential area. His suspicion grew into certainty, and he followed her. He parked his car nearby and spent several minutes observing the busy traffic outside the building. Gathering his courage, the man approached the door and knocked. The host opened the door, surprised by the stranger's appearance. The husband explained he was looking for his wife. The host initially tried to politely refuse entry, but the man's insistence and aggressive tone forced him to relent. The man entered, where he immediately smelled alcohol, heard laughter, and heard loud music. The atmosphere he encountered was a stark contrast to his idea of family life. Some of those present tried to stop him, but he confidently headed toward the rooms from which muffled sounds were emanating. Witnesses recalled that he appeared tense, his face contorted with anger. When he opened the bedroom door, he saw his wife with 3 men. The scene shocked him. Not only had she cheated on him, but she had done so demonstratively, participating in what he considered humiliation. According to eyewitnesses, there was a moment of silence in the room. Everyone present froze, realizing the situation could escalate into conflict. The man screamed, accusing his wife of betrayal. He hurled insults, accusing those present of destroying his family. His wife tried to explain, but her words only intensified his rage. The altercation quickly began. One of the men, standing next to the woman, tried to intervene and escort her husband out of the room. A verbal altercation ensued, escalating into a physical altercation. The other partygoers tried to separate the two, but the tension escalated. The man felt humiliated and pushed to his limits. Witnesses noted that his behavior showed no signs of rationality. He was shouting, waving his arms, and refusing to respond to requests to calm down. His wife, in shock, alternately tried to intervene and then retreated, realizing she couldn't control the situation. The host tried to call a taxi for the husband, or at least take him outside, but he stubbornly resisted. The situation grew increasingly dangerous. The partygoers realized that a simple dispute was escalating into an aggressive confrontation. At this point, no one suspected there was already a weapon in the house. Later, the investigation would establish that the husband had taken a kitchen knife from the house, intending only to intimidate his wife and her friends. However, in the tense situation, this knife would soon become the murder weapon. The chapter concludes with the aggression reaching its peak and attempts to defuse the situation having failed. The man remained in the room, surrounded by his opponents and humiliated by what he had seen. His emotional state had reached a critical point, and in a few minutes, events would occur that would change the lives of everyone present. The moment the man entered the bedroom and saw his wife in the company of 3 men, the situation reached a breaking point. His emotional state could be described as explosive. His eyes were bloodshot, his breathing was heavy, his hands were shaking. The words he shouted were incoherent, interspersed with insults and accusations. The atmosphere in the room reached a breaking point. One of the men, a partygoer, tried to escort him out of the room, placing a hand on his shoulder and urging him to calm down and talk downstairs. But this gesture provoked even greater aggression. The man abruptly pushed him away and pulled a kitchen knife he brought with him from his belt. In the first seconds after the weapon appeared, everyone froze. No one expected the argument to take such a turn. The owner of the house, hearing the noise, entered the room and tried to intervene. He raised his hands, urging her husband to put down the knife and go outside, but he was in no mood for persuasion. His wife, at this point, desperately screamed, trying to stop her husband, but her words had no effect. For him, what was happening was the culmination of months of suspicion and internal pain. The first victim was the man standing closest. He stepped forward, intending to disarm his enraged husband. His response was a knife thrust into his chest. The wound proved fatal. Blood began rapidly filling the victim's clothing, and he fell to the floor. Panic gripped the others. The women in the house screamed. Some ran for the exit, others tried to call the police. The second man attempted to grab the attacker's arm, but he acted with extreme fury. A struggle ensued, during which the husband stabbed him several times. One blow landed in the abdomen, another in the neck. The victim collapsed to the floor, trying to cover the wounds with his hands. He died a few minutes later from massive blood loss. The room was in chaos. The wife screamed, begging her husband to stop, but she kept her distance, afraid to approach. Two other men and several women ran out into the hallway, some trying to find something to subdue the aggressor, but the situation was unfolding too quickly. After the second fatal blow, the man stopped and froze for a moment. His breathing was ragged, his hands were shaking, and the knife was covered in blood. He looked at his wife, speechless. She stood in the corner of the room, her hands pressed to her face. She would later testify that at that moment, she felt as if he hesitated between attacking her and stopping. The homeowner called the police, screaming into the phone that a murder had occurred. Several people ran outside, meeting the arriving neighbors who had heard screams and noise. A sense of terror gripped everyone remaining in the house. As the attacker left the room, several people met him in the hallway. They tried to block his passage, but he merely pushed them away. The knife was still in his hands, and people were afraid to approach. At that moment, he made no attempt to attack anyone, but his appearance inspired genuine fear. He went into the kitchen, sat at the table, and remained silent for a while. His wife, according to eyewitnesses, was still in shock and hesitated to approach. The other guests tried to keep their distance, aware that the slightest provocation could spark a new outbreak of violence. The police arrived about 10 minutes after the call. By this time, the two men were already dead. The house was silent, broken only by the sobs and cries of women. The officers entered with their guns drawn, demanding the man drop the knife. He offered no resistance, placed the gun on the table, and raised his hands. The arrest took place without further incident. The man was let out in handcuffs, and his wife stood nearby, repeating the same thing over and over. "I didn't think it would end like this." Neighbors gathered outside the house watched the scene unfold, unsure of what exactly had happened inside. Forensic experts later documented numerous signs of a struggle at the scene: bloodstains on the floor and furniture, an overturned table, and damaged furnishings. The knife used in the murder was seized as the primary piece of evidence. Thus, what began as a family quarrel escalated into a double murder in a matter of minutes. It was clear to investigators that the husband's actions were impulsive, driven by severe emotional distress. However, the gravity of the crime remained undeniable. Two men were killed, witnesses were in shock, and the situation itself received widespread coverage in the local media. The first police officers arrived at the house a few minutes after the call. Several party guests were already outside, running out in panic. They greeted the officers with shouts, pointing to the door, and talking about two dead people inside. The situation appeared chaotic, but the police's priority was to subdue the attacker and ensure he posed no threat to others. The man who committed the murder was already sitting at the kitchen table by then. A bloody knife lay in front of him. According to witnesses, he made no attempt to escape and took no active steps after the attack. When the officers entered, he complied with their orders. He placed his hands on the table and then allowed them to handcuff him. There was no resistance. The wife was taken to another room, where she was in shock. She cried and repeated that she hadn't expected this outcome. She was immediately separated from the other witnesses so that she could later take separate statements. Forensic experts and investigators were called to the scene. 2 male bodies were found in the bedroom where the murder occurred. One lay near the bed, the other closer to the doorway. Attempts to resuscitate both men were unsuccessful before the police arrived, but their injuries were not life-threatening. Medics pronounced them dead at the scene. Forensic experts began their examination, recording the location of the bodies, traces of blood, shoe prints, and other details. Numerous blood stains were discovered on the floor, walls, and furniture, indicating an intense struggle. Slip marks were found on the carpet, as well as blood stains leading to the hallway. All of this corroborated witness accounts that the attacker struck in a fit of rage, while the victims resisted. The knife used in the murder was seized and stored as evidence. Forensic experts noted that it was an ordinary kitchen knife with a blade approximately 20 centimeters long. Subsequent examination revealed the blood of both victims and the fingerprints of the accused on the blade. Police interviewed the party participants. Most witnesses said it all began with the husband's unexpected appearance. They described his behavior as aggressive and erratic. Many reported that he yelled and insulted his wife, then pulled out a knife. The homeowner confirmed that he tried to stop him and get him out, but was too late. The conflict quickly escalated into a fight. The wife gave a detailed statement. She admitted to attending similar parties before, hiding it from her husband. She said that she had indeed lied to him that evening, saying she was working late. When her husband burst into the house, she became frightened and tried to stop him, but was unable to influence the situation. She emphasized that she had not expected such a violent reaction. The accused himself remained silent in the first hours after his arrest. During interrogation, he stated that he had not planned the murder and had taken the knife for self-defense. He claimed he had wanted to catch his wife in a lie and talk to her, but upon seeing her in the bedroom with other men, he lost control. He later claimed he had acted under extreme emotional distress and had not realized how many blows he had inflicted. The investigation carefully examined possible motives and circumstances. On the one hand, the theory of passion was confirmed. His actions appeared impulsive. On the other hand, the fact that he had grabbed a knife from home beforehand was seen as a sign of some kind of preparation. The prosecutor's office was inclined to believe that this was not an accident, but a crime committed with direct intent. Psychologists were brought in to assess the defendant's condition. The examination revealed that he had no mental disorders, but was under acute emotional stress at the time of the crime. However, the experts concluded that he was aware of his actions and was able to control himself. Public outreach efforts were also underway. Local media received information about the incident on the first night. Reports described a bloody massacre at a party, emphasizing shocking details. Public interest was intense, as the case involved adultery and 2 victims. The family's reputation was ruined in the eyes of neighbors and colleagues. A few days later, the defendant was formally charged with the murder of 2 people. He was charged with first-degree murder, although his defense attorney insisted on a charge of manslaughter. Police completed the initial stage of the investigation, collecting witness statements, expert opinions, and physical evidence. The key findings of the investigation were as follows. The accused arrived at the party knowingly and had a knife with him. The conflict began because of jealousy and betrayal. The victims died from multiple stab wounds. The accused actions were quick, but quite deliberate. Based on these materials, the case was sent to court. A long trial lay ahead, during which it would be necessary to determine the extent to which the husband's guilt could be considered mitigated by his emotional state and the circumstances of his infidelity. The trial began several months after the tragedy. The case generated widespread public attention, so the courtroom was packed with journalists and local residents. In the dock sat a man accused of murdering 2 people. His appearance had changed significantly. During his time in custody, he had lost weight, his face had become haggard, and his demeanor had become reserved and distant. The prosecutor's office based its case on the premeditation. The prosecution argued that the defendant had brought a knife from home, which in itself indicated premeditation. The prosecutor described the events of the evening in detail. the sudden intrusion into the party, the aggressive shouts, and the subsequent stabbings. Particular attention was paid to the testimony of witnesses who claimed that they repeatedly attempted to stop the defendant, but he continued to attack. The defense attorney insisted otherwise. He claimed the defendant acted in a state of emotional distress, brought on by a sudden and extremely traumatic circumstance. The sight of his wife in an intimate setting with other men, he claimed, was the final straw in a long-running conflict. The attorney cited psychologists' reports confirming the defendant's emotional distress. Witnesses were heard at the hearings. The owner of the house where the party was held described in detail how he tried to stop the man, but he refused to budge. The wife testified separately. She described how she had indeed concealed her encounters, but emphasized that she hadn't expected such a reaction. Her words betrayed a sense of guilt, but they did not mitigate the charges. Forensic experts provided detailed reports on the nature of the injuries. Doctors noted that the blows were delivered with great force and targeted vital areas. This confirmed that the defendant had the opportunity to stop, but he continued to act. After several weeks of hearings, the court delivered its verdict. The man was found guilty of murdering 2 people and sentenced to a lengthy prison term, life without parole. The judge emphasized that while the defendant's emotional state may have played a role, it does not justify murder. Reactions in the courtroom were mixed. The relatives of the victims expressed satisfaction with the verdict. The defendant's wife, who was present when the verdict was read, wept and left the courtroom without commenting. Thus ended the process. The legal point was made, and the fate of the defendant was finally decided. A bloody massacre at a swingers party resulted in a life sentence for the husband. 2 men died. Witnesses were left in shock, and the family was completely destroyed. The story became an example of how jealousy and a hidden life can lead to tragedy.